People don't understand power. They keep imagining it as a person, a face, a logo, a family name printed on fancy letterhead. But real power rarely looks like a throne. It looks like quiet infrastructure, like paperwork, like foundations, like curriculum, like research that never really leaves the room where it was funded. And most importantly, it looks like something that cannot be hated directly. Because you can't punch a foundation the way you can punch a tyrant, you can't boycott a policy memo the way you boycott a brand. You can only feel a vague irritation, a low-grade unease, and then you go back to your life while the system keeps working. Today, we're going to talk about two famous families often wrapped in conspiracy stories: Rothschild-style narratives, Rockefeller-style narratives, and the familiar internet reflex that turns everything into a child's drawing of puppets on strings. I'm not interested in the cheap version. I'm interested in the psychological architecture underneath the myths. The truth is darker and also more boring, which is why people avoid it. Because the uncomfortable reality is this: power doesn't need to stay rich forever. Power needs to stay protected. Power needs to stay distributed. Power needs to outlive public outrage, and it needs to do it while looking like it's doing good. If you want to understand how certain elites remain influential across wars, economic collapses, and generational churn, you have to stop asking how much money do they have and start asking how are they organized so they never have to fight the way ordinary people fight. Let's begin with the spectacle you keep missing. You never see these people on a daily ranking list. You never see them live tweeting their opinions. You don't get the pleasure of watching them defend themselves in public comment sections. That invisibility isn't just modesty, it's strategy. It's psychological camouflage. Power that stays calm in public is harder to target. And once you understand that, you start seeing a pattern not only among old money families, but among the most effective systems in your everyday life. Now, one of the reasons these families trigger conspiracy thinking is because their wealth is not staged like a Kardashian lifestyle. The modern world trains you to believe that visibility equals power, posting equals legitimacy, performative wealth equals control of reality. So when you see someone wealthy who refuses to perform, your mind scrambles for an explanation. It will invent stories. It will fill gaps with fantasy. It will say they must be hiding because they must be plotting. But the deeper explanation is more human, more psychological, and frankly more depressing. People hide because exposure creates risk. And risk is what power cannot afford. In the case of European banking dynasties, the wealth is structured across generations, across companies, across legal entities, across countries. It doesn't sit in one place where a single scandal can crush everything. It exists as a network. Like a root system underground, you don't see it grow day by day, but the plant survives storms because the structure is already built. So you have one form of ancient power: banking and investment, yes, but also cultural ownership, property, and private institutions that don't need to announce themselves. Their money can look like art collections, real estate assets, and opaque corporate holdings. The point is not just discretion, the point is resilience. They avoid the most dangerous vulnerability of modern wealth: daily market dependence. Elon Musk can lose hundreds of billions on paper when a stock drops, and he can also recover with a rebound. That's volatility in a dramatic, visible costume. But old wealth learns a different lesson. They don't store power only in symbols that wobble in public. They distribute their holdings so that one collapse does not turn into humiliation. They don't want a bad week to become a news cycle. They want a bad week to be a rounding error. There's another family archetype too: the industrial and commodity origin story. The person who built a monopoly in oil. The person who became the richest man in a generation. And then the legal system arrives. Antitrust, turf splits, breaking up of control. And here is the first uncomfortable truth: power that survives doesn't cling to the old mechanism. It learns how to mutate when the state squeezes it. When the American government broke Standard Oil into smaller companies, the headline looked like defeat. But the deeper reality is that the family's power reorganized. The monopoly was shattered, but the family did not dissolve. They moved into the subsidiaries, into the next structures. They continued operating through capital management and, crucially, through foundations. That's the part people miss because it sounds too civilized. Foundations sound like charity. Charity sounds like morality. Morality sounds like something you can trust. But charity is also a tool. Not always a weapon, not always a crime. Often it's worse than a weapon. Often it's a strategy that works because it feels respectable. Now we need to talk about the word that makes people stop thinking: foundation. If you're Vietnamese or if you grew up around the typical meaning of charity, you may imagine money moving outward. relief funds, disaster assistance, scholarships, a simple story of giving to those in pain. That is not how the most influential Western foundations operate at scale. The foundations connected to powerful dynasties often function less like a public service and more like an investment engine with a moral shield. Let me say it plainly. These institutions can serve three goals at the same time. First, they can preserve wealth across generations by moving assets into a legal structure that is not treated like personal property. Personal assets get inherited, and inheritance gets fragmented. It creates dilution. It turns power into smaller shares. It forces families to distribute and eventually dissipate their influence into dozens or hundreds of descendants. A foundation changes the rules. The structure is meant to persist. It can keep large wealth concentrated without triggering the same kind of generational breakdown. It's not illegal to do this, it's simply smart use of legal design. Second, foundations build social legitimacy. They make the family harder to demonize. They create a narrative of responsibility. When you can point to hospitals, universities, public health initiatives, and scientific research, critics can't easily accuse you of greed without sounding bitter or ignorant. Third, and most important, foundations generate soft power that shapes the future, not by brute force, by shaping knowledge, training, networks, and policy pathways. This is the heart of modern influence. It's not they control everything. It's they steer what becomes thinkable, and that psychological steering is subtle enough that most people experience it as common sense. Most people think research is neutral, most people assume academia is independent, most people forget that funding is a filter, and every filter changes what you see. When a foundation supports specific areas of research, it doesn't just fund scientists, it funds a worldview, it funds particular methods, particular assumptions, particular definitions of what counts as evidence, then policymakers cite those studies. Then institutions implement those policies. Then the result becomes science, even though the starting point was strategic. So the public gets a story that feels objective. The public thinks governments are making decisions based on evidence. But the quieter story is, evidence gets produced through streams of money, and those streams aren't created by randomness. Now let's go deeper into the psychological reason this works so well, because if you understand the psychology, you'll stop blaming villains and start recognizing mechanisms. People hate direct control. The human brain is allergic to being dominated. So any power that announces itself too loudly creates resistance. If you say, openly, I am influencing policy, you immediately trigger backlash. People fight it because fighting restores psychological autonomy. But soft power doesn't announce itself. It arrives as education, as scholarship, as conferences, as endowments, as grants, as community initiatives. It becomes invisible, or at least it becomes socially protected by virtue. Nobody wants to be the person who attacks scholarships. Nobody wants to be the person who cancels public health research. Nobody wants to be the person who says, I don't like these grants because they influence me. So the system gets to operate under a moral umbrella. Criticism becomes socially costly. Even when people suspect something, they don't act because action feels impolite. That is not conspiracy. That is sociology. You can see this in how people respond when a billionaire openly involves themselves in politics. The criticism becomes immediate. Conspiracy theories explode. Certain countries even regulate or ban people who seem too overt. But when influence is distributed into respectable institutions, it becomes harder to target. The family disappears into bureaucracy. You don't have a single villain. You have a committee. You have an academic partnership. You have a philanthropic program. And when there is no villain, people lose energy. They stop. They resign. They accept the story that it's just the way the world works. Now, there is another uncomfortable reality that makes modern influence extremely difficult to map. Power today is not concentrated in one family the way it used to be. Old dynasties can still be enormously wealthy. They can still be enormously influential. But the center of gravity in modern economies is spread across multiple players: large investment funds, government-linked capital, technology corporations, pension systems, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. The effect on you is emotional. Your mind wants a single handle, a single button, a single name you can curse. When you don't find it, you either call it fake or you call it secret. Either way, you don't build a practical understanding. The real truth is more painful. Power is now distributed into a complex system. That means it's harder to fight, but it also means it's harder to fully control. Old elites became less like dictators and more like engineers. They don't always pull levers. They build environments where certain outcomes become likely. So what happens when you compare old family wealth to modern tech wealth? The contrast is not just about more money. It's about the psychological design of assets. Modern billionaires often hold wealth in publicly traded stocks and highly visible enterprises. Their wealth is measured daily. The world watches their net worth like it's a live heartbeat. When the market drops, their wealth drops. When the market rebounds, their wealth rebounds. Their power is therefore tied to performance in real time, tied to narratives, tied to reputation, tied to hype cycles. Old dynasties often hold wealth in assets that don't behave like stocks. Real estate that doesn't crash overnight. Private companies that can keep operating in darkness. art, collections, and other forms of value that are difficult to liquidate quickly and therefore difficult to destroy suddenly. And then layered on top of that, foundations that preserve wealth and create continuity. So during crises like the 2008 financial crash, their losses can be limited relative to the scale of their assets. During a pandemic crash, market panic hits stock portfolios harder than it hits property and long-term investments. This is not magic, it's structure, it's psychological resilience built into finance. Now, this brings us to a question people don't ask because it makes them feel powerless. If the state intervened, if antitrust laws broke monopolies, if taxes increased for the ultra-rich, why didn't these families collapse? The answer is not that they are protected by secret agents or that the government is owned by a single bloodline. The answer is simpler and more threatening because it implies you can't fix it by hating one group. They survived because they didn't rely on one mechanism, they adjusted. Over centuries, they learned to switch strategies when the environment changed. In the early industrial era, dominance could be built through monopolies and direct industrial control. But when governments discovered how monopoly harms competition, the rules changed. The state became a referee. So old elites stopped being the referee's easiest target by avoiding the exact thing that invites punishment. If you can't control 90% of an industry without getting crushed, then you control smaller shares across more industries, and you move influence into softer channels that are hard for regulators to identify as coercive. They learn to become less visible and more institutional. Now, let's talk about the most misunderstood piece, the idea that foundations are just charity. It's emotionally comforting to believe that large philanthropic funds exist purely to help, and many times, they genuinely do fund good work. Hospitals need money. Public health programs need money. Universities need funding. But the moral comfort is exactly what allows the strategy to work, because when people think philanthropy is purely altruistic, they don't examine the hidden functions. Foundations can reduce inheritance taxes. They can avoid wealth fragmentation. They can preserve capital indefinitely. They can select research agendas. They can build networks of future policymakers. They can shape education so that students internalize certain assumptions long before they ever hold power. And because the work is publicly framed as good, it is shielded from the kind of skepticism that would apply to ordinary lobbying. A lobbying effort says, give us policy. A foundation says, here is money to study. Here is money to train. Here is money for public health. If the research outputs align with the foundation's preferences, nobody calls it bribery because it looks like science. If future officials benefited from scholarships or fellowships, nobody calls it corruption because the path looks like a merit story. That's why this system is so durable. It hides in narratives. It disguises influence as opportunity. Now imagine being a student who gets a scholarship from such a foundation. You're talented. You're hungry. You want to contribute. You might not be a cynic. You might genuinely believe you're being supported. Then your research direction is shaped by the institutions that already have funding. Your advisors are connected to the foundation's networks. Your academic culture becomes aligned. At first, you don't feel manipulated. You feel grateful. That gratitude is powerful. Gratitude is psychological glue. It makes people defend their benefactors without realizing they are defending an agenda. Later, when you join government or industry, you don't need to be told what to think. You already learned it. And if you ever try to question the worldview, you face a subtle psychological threat. You risk alienating your career ecosystem. So the foundation doesn't just buy outcomes, it buys training pipelines. And training pipelines are one of the most effective forms of control because they shape identity. They shape how people understand their role in the world. Now we get to your life, because this is where the channel's theme hits, the hidden self. Most people who get angry about conspiracies aren't just curious. They are often avoiding a deeper, more personal truth. They feel small in their own world. They feel excluded. They feel like systems decide outcomes for them. They can't influence their environment. They can't change their job. They can't get respect. They can't get the money they want. So they reach for grand explanations because grand explanations soothe the ego in a twisted way. If the reason you suffer is secret elites pulling strings,